Let's talk affordable electric cars, because if you're in the market for one of these two is likely to be high on your consideration list. That's right, for today's EV comparison test, we've grabbed the MG4 and the BYD Dolphin, both relatively affordable, both have long driving ranges, and both hail from China. In fact, they're the same in a lot of metrics. So how do they differ? Which one is better? And which one will suit your lifestyle? Well, stick with us to find out.
First up, let's talk price. Just taking the sticker price, only $100 separates these two. But there's a little more to the story, because the BYD has a before on-roads price tag, while the MG is drive away. See the prices on your screen now. It's important to note that we don't have the absolute most affordable version of each car. Instead, we've got the next rung up, which means we've got the BYD Dolphin Premium and the MG4 Excite 64. It's also important to note that the Dolphin's price may vary quite a bit depending on what state-based incentives are available to you.
Now, we're going to get to standard equipment in just a second, but we do know that one of your primary concerns when it comes to EVs is going to be that driving range. So we'll show that first up for each car. Both are pretty impressive considering their price point. And keep in mind, those numbers that we're showing you now are WLTP numbers and not any DC numbers, which means they're more accurate to the real world.
Okay, back to standard gear. First, let's cover off all the things which both cars get. This includes 17-inch alloy wheels, with the MG getting aerodynamic hubcaps. The BYD wears Chinese Linglong tires made specifically for it, as you can see with the Dolphin imprints, while the MG shows off its international credentials with more impressive Continental tires. Both cars also score LED headlights, climate control, and vehicle-to-load systems.
Now, if you do want to check out a comprehensive list of standard inclusions in nice, tidy table format, you can do that at our full written comparison test over at carsguide.com.au. But once you dig into the detail, it's clear that one car comes out on top.
The Dolphin impresses us the most with its power adjust and heated front seats, its synthetic leather seat trim, panoramic sunroof, larger multimedia screen which even rotates, the presence of a wireless phone charger, and its 360-degree parking camera. This compares well when you consider the relatively Spartan interior of the MG4, which is missing a few of those key items. Still, I wouldn't write it off because it scores points in other important areas.
Now, while they're both hatchbacks, each car here takes such a different approach to both its exterior and interior design that which one appeals to you the most is going to be entirely subjective.
The MG, for example, is clearly aiming for international acceptance with a quite conservative exterior appearance and an almost minimalist interior. The Dolphin, on the other hand, is unapologetically wacky in a lot of ways, and I do mean that in a good way. Highlights for the MG include a very traditional hatchback silhouette with an appealing set of LED headlights and that trendy split light bar out the rear. It's also very international with a lack of overt badging like you see on a lot of its Chinese rivals, and I think it even pulls off the black paint very well. Not all cars do. Things which I think are a little more up for debate, well, that includes the aerodynamic hubcaps, which make it look very base model-y, and the weird cropped spoiler bit out the back will always remind you that you didn't splash for a more expensive version, you know, one with an actual spoiler. Meanwhile, the Dolphin looks a little different. It's got an odd little square face offset by its curvy lines, and compared to the MG, it looks very narrow and compact. The two-tone paint, two-tone alloy wheels, black highlights, and actual complete spoiler out the rear make it look a bit more upmarket, at least in my opinion, compared to the MG, although I think the MG has a more universal appeal. It's a similar story on the inside.
When it comes to the MG's cabin design, I think it's a lot more minimalist than what's going on in the Dolphin. It's almost minimalist to a fault. It's kind of very simple and monotone, but I do think that will make it more universally appealing, and it feels a lot more spacious in here. So that goes a long way to make this car feel bigger and more appropriate for a family. But one thing I will say is the materials also aren't as good as they are in the Dolphin. There's a lot more hard plastic trims through the doors and across the dash and down the center here, and your knee even rests on a hard plastic on this little console here. So it doesn't feel as upmarket as the Dolphin either. Also, these seats, they're clad in cloth, which I don't always mind these days, and there's some clever little sort of blue piping on them to give them a little bit of intrigue, but they are narrower than they are in the Dolphin, and they're not quite as spongy and comfortable, so that's worth keeping in mind too. Software is another area where I'd like MG to do a little bit better as well. And it really does start with that digital dash cluster in here, because I know you don't need to have gauges in an electric car, but there are just so many numbers on this little screen that it almost looks like accounting software. Like, surely they could have made it look a little bit nicer. And the same almost goes for this center touchscreen here. Yes, this software stack is much improved over MGs which have come before the MG4, but it's still not as fast or responsive as the software suite in the Dolphin, and the screen is much smaller as well. I will say Apple CarPlay does look a little bit sharper on this screen than it does in the Dolphin, but again, it's not wireless in either car either, so worth keeping in mind. There's also no shortcut buttons. There's just an on and off button for the climate unit, and you've got these kind of static buttons for volume control, and there's a shortcut for to have the defogger turn on. So it would be nice to see some non-touch based controls for the climate, but that goes for both cars. In terms of practicality, I think this cabin is nice and spacious, like we talked about before. It's also adjustable. This wheel's got both telescopic and up and down adjustability. There's nice kind of cutaways in the doors, plenty of room for our CarsGuide bottle. There's two more with adjustable edges down here, plenty of room for our bottle again. There's also a sort of console box here sort of thing. It's very shallow. I can't fit many objects in here, maybe a wallet or a phone. It's got a textured base to it, which is nice, and you can close it up so your objects won't leave. There's also a weird little net here, not sure what that's useful for. Maybe you could put your keys there, I guess. But this car does get a traditional center console box, which is nice to have. Okay, so the MG4's back seat, it's pretty good. I'd say in a lot of ways it's not as impressive as it is in the Dolphin. That's behind my own driving position. Still plenty of room for my knees, plenty of headroom too, at 182 centimeters tall. And the floor is almost flat, but the cabin is wider. So I think even this center seat will be quite useful for an adult as well. Then things start to get less good. For a start, there's much more hard plastic all through the doors in the MG4. There's no pockets on the backs of the front seats. There's no drop-down armrests. There's not even a bottle holder in the door, and there's not even a bottle holder in the center. So I've got nowhere to put that. I'll just put it in the front. Just like in the Dolphin, there's no adjustable air vents, and there's only one USB port for rear passengers. That's basically the only amenity you get in here. So yes, it's spacious. I do think that this space will be better for families, but I do think that this is one of those areas where you can notice how much of a base model the MG is, especially compared to what's offered in the Dolphin. Now, it's a similar story on the inside, where the Dolphin does take a bit of a zany approach in here. It's really a car for someone who's not afraid of driving around in something a little bit different, but there's lots of things that I really like about it too. It's not just weird and different, it's the choice of materials, it's some of the design points, it's the way that this little like button console has been integrated in here. It's very clever. You've got your shifter, you've got your volume control, and you've got a few shortcut buttons here. There's not as many as I'd like. I'd like to see a few more shortcut buttons for things like air conditioning, but we'll talk about that in a second. Of course, one of the biggest draws for BYD's interiors is the huge multimedia screen. Now, the software could look better in here. It's not as sharp as some rivals, but it is pretty fast, which is nice. And in some ways it is just sort of like a blatant Android reskin. And of course it does have the typical BYD gimmick of being able to turn on its side. I'm not really sure how useful this will be. I guess if you've got another car that's got a portrait-oriented multimedia screen, it might offer you some familiarity to use it this way, but it is also notable that Apple CarPlay doesn't work when it's in this orientation. So I found that I didn't use it an awful lot, but hey, you might like the fact that it does that. And elsewhere, just like other BYDs too, there are a lot of references to this car's namesake. You've got the little flipper door handle pieces, you've got these kind of like wavy patterns through the dash up here, and this kind of like almost like a dolphin eyeball for the air vent here, which is kind of cool. It is very different, and I think it does take a certain buyer, but hey, the important thing is it's comfortable in here, it looks good, and the choice of materials are really thoughtful. Okay, so for practicality, there are some notable differences between the Dolphin and the MG. There's some good stuff and some not good stuff. The main not good thing is it is notably smaller in the Dolphin's cabin compared to the MG. That narrowness, you can feel that in here, and the dark trimmings and everything, it does make it feel like a noticeably smaller space than you get in the MG. But there are some other things which I really like about this car. Firstly, the seats. These are like big thrones. They're made of synthetic leather and that neoprene material down the middle again, and they're really comfortable, noticeably more comfortable than the ones in the MG4. So I really like that about it, and that goes a long way to making this car feel more comfortable over longer distances as well. Next up is this little digital dash thing. Yes, it's smaller than the one in the MG4, but it's attached to the steering column, so you can adjust the wheel up and down and back and forth, and it always stays in the same spot. So you're never blocking it with the top of the wheel or anything like that, and that can't be said for the MG. And the other thing I like about it is you've got electric adjust for both the front seats, which goes a long way to make this car feel a bit more upmarket. Okay, cabin storage. We've got a large bottle holder in the doors. Just fits our CarsGuide bottle, but it barely fits in these two center ones, which are noticeably smaller, and they don't have those kind of adjustable edges. There's a tray up here, which you can use for things like phones, wallets, keys, you name it. And there's a slide open console box down here for objects that you might not want to exit while you're in the corners, which is kind of nice. Obviously, your two bottle holders there, and there's a wireless charger, which kind of integrates into this design, but you don't get a center console box. Instead, there's a large pass-through area under here. Not bad. Let's go look in the back seat. Now, I bet you were thinking that the Dolphin wouldn't be this good in the back seat. That's behind my own seating position. I'm 182 centimeters tall, and as you can see, I've got plenty of room there for my knees. The floor's nice and flat, so it's nice and wide in here. It feels wider than it actually is. And that center seat, while it is narrower than the MG4, I think it could still be useful for putting like even an adult in here, just because of that flat floor there too. There's also some nice things about this car which the MG4 doesn't get. For example, there are plenty of different sized pockets on the back of that front seat. There's an extended amount of these sort of neoprene and synthetic leather trims, which I really like. And there's more storage too. Let's have a look. So firstly, in the door, there's plenty of room for your bottle. There's another weird kind of bottle holdery thing on the back of the center console. I'm not sure how useful that actually is. I feel like anything is just going to spill out of there. But you do get a drop-down armrest as well. Again, trimmed in that synthetic leather and with kind of edges on it so that you can fit larger bottles in as well. You don't get that in the trim of the MG4 that this car is competing with on this test. One thing you don't get, and neither car on this test gets, is adjustable air vents for the rear row, but the BYD does get a USB-A and a USB-C connector.
One area where the MG definitely comes out on top is its boot capacity. While the Dolphin doesn't really fit the whole CarsGuide luggage set, it's much easier in the MG, which offers a wide, open and square space, which is surprising because on paper it only offers 18 litres more capacity. Unfortunately, both cars miss out on a spare wheel with just a tyre repair kit available, and neither have additional under the bonnet storage.
This leads us nicely to what's under the bonnet, and to be honest, there's not a whole lot to see here. There's just sort of a mishmash of cooling hardware and hard plastics and stuff. But here are the power figures. See them on your screen now. The most important difference to note between these two models is that the BYD is front-wheel drive while the MG4 is rear-wheel drive.
We'll also remind you of the range on offer. Not bad, considering they're relatively affordable. And there's not a lot between them thanks to similar curb weights and similar battery capacities. The BYD uses its signature space-saving blade format with lithium iron phosphate chemistry, while the MG4 uses a nickel manganese cobalt battery at this spec level. This might explain why the BYD continued to fast charge well past 90%, while the MG tapered off quickly. For what it's worth, the MG is technically capable of charging much faster at its peak, while the BYD charges quite a bit slower. Frustratingly, both are only capable of charging at 7 kilowatts on AC, making it hardly worth plugging into an AC charger at your local shops, as you'll only extract about 50 kilometers of range an hour. See the total energy efficiency for both cars on your screen now. We took both on a roughly 200 kilometer drive loop, and here's the real-world consumption for each car. Both cars overshot their claims, see that on the screen now, with the MG performing slightly better overall.
Now recently, MG hasn't exactly been known for its driving dynamics, but I think with this MG4 there's a real notable step up in pretty much everything. Ride quality, the quality of the electric motor, pretty much everything. So there's a lot to like here. One thing that's instantly noticeable once you hop behind the wheel of the MG4 is the excellent visibility on offer. There's this huge windscreen, nice wing mirrors, big kind of glass house effect to all of the windows in this car. So I really like that about it. It feels spacious, it feels easy to see out of, and that's going to make it easy to drive around a city. Next up, steering. The MG4's got quite a light steering tune, and it's a little bit doughy, if I'm honest, compared to the really nice direct feel of the Dolphin. So while this steering isn't as fun and engaging as the Dolphin can be, it is nice and light and easy to steer around at low speeds. And that can be important when it comes to parking or navigating around tight city streets. So again, suited to a city as well as out on the open road. And I say that because the MG4, well, it's got a few benefits over the Dolphin here. Yes, it's rear-wheel drive. Oddly, that doesn't make it fun, but it does make it better out on the freeway. It feels a bit more stately. It feels a bit more secure in itself on the open road, and I really like that about it. Now, interestingly, while the MG has less torque on paper than the Dolphin, it actually feels more powerful and as though it has more follow through when you're traveling at speed. So while the figures don't seem to indicate it, this is the car that feels the more powerful of the two. Also, the ride quality is really good. It's actually great in both cars, but for different reasons. Here in the MG4, it's fairly forgiving over small bumps, although it is firmer over larger bumps like that. And it does give it quite a bit more control than the Dolphin has. The Dolphin might be softer and more comfortable over larger bumps, but the control the MG offers in the corners and over undulations and corrugations is noticeable. Noise levels in both cars, again, is pretty under control. But here in the MG4, I think the combination of the nicer tyres as well as some significant sound deadening does make it a little bit quieter at freeway speeds. Interestingly though, at lower speeds, there's quite a bit of dull thrumming from the suspension which comes through into the cabin, which you don't get in the Dolphin. I also quite like the tuning of the safety systems in the MG. While I found the Dolphin's adaptive cruise and lane keep systems to be a tad twitchy, here in the MG they're a little bit more chill. Both cars have some slightly annoying features when it comes to the traffic sign recognition, but other than that they've impressed me, especially for Chinese cars on this test. So there you go. Okay, so the Dolphin, what do we like and not like so much about it? For a start, the visibility is notably worse in here compared to the MG4. These big A-pillars kind of close things in a lot, and there's only a tiny strip of a rear window to see out of at the back. But it does feel overall more compact, so that sort of makes up for it in some way. It does feel like it's going to be easier to park in narrow spaces and zip down laneways. Perhaps the biggest advantage behind the wheel for the Dolphin is its like dead accurate, really fast steering that's full of feel. It makes this car so much fun to drive, and I know on paper it seems like the MG4 is going to be the more fun of the two because it's rear-wheel drive, but it turns out front-wheel drive doesn't really take away from the Dolphin that much. It's quite light and breezy and athletic, and it's a lot of fun to drive. Although it is worth noting that it doesn't feel as fast as the MG4. While it's got the same amount of power and more torque on paper, that's not really communicated to the accelerator pedal. It does feel a little bit less strong in that kind of mid-range acceleration point, which was interesting to find. But while it does feel overall more fun to drive than the MG4, I will say that the handling's not quite as good. The affordable Chinese tyres that ship on this car from the factory do feel a little under pressure in the corners, and you can hear quite a bit of tyre torture, especially from those front wheels when you throw it into a few curvy bends. So it's not as confident as the MG4, but it is still quite a bit of fun. One area where the Dolphin really does shine though is its ride quality. It's got a nice soft edge on it even compared to the MG4, which is starting from a really good base. It handles big bumps and corrugations and these sorts of surfaces which you're likely to encounter around a city really well. However, that's not without a trade-off, because over undulating road surfaces, the Dolphin does lose a fair bit of composure and it starts to feel a bit floaty. Still, I know which one I would rather drive around a city every day. In terms of refinement, as I said before, both of these cars are really quite impressive considering their price point. But the Dolphin is slightly less refined, I would say, in the cabin, particularly at freeway speeds compared to the MG4. This could be down to several factors. I think one of the major ones is the more affordable set of tyres on this car, which make a lot of tyre roar start to enter the cabin at over 80 kilometers an hour. In terms of active safety kit, of course, the Dolphin gets all of those tick boxes. But one thing I will say is the adaptive cruise control in this car is nowhere near as good as a lot of its rivals, and it's not as good as the MG. The steering in particular is really quite twitchy. That's the lane keep assist system as well. It just sort of like suddenly jerks the wheel out of your hand, which can be a little bit disconcerting. And it also has a propensity to beep at you with that traffic sign recognition system, which can sometimes pick up the wrong speed off the back of buses and the like. So worth keeping in mind. Both cars have good safety systems, but both cars also have slightly annoying traits, with the MG being probably the better of the two, especially on the open road.
Both cars have maximum 5-star ANCAP safety ratings, and in terms of ticking boxes, get auto emergency braking, lane keep assist, and adaptive cruise control. However, only the Dolphin gets a few extra items like blind spot monitoring, rear cross traffic alert, and a 360-degree parking camera.
There's always a big question about ownership for electric vehicles, and nothing says that more than the different service terms between these two vehicles, but also the fact that they've got different warranties. They're ahead of the industry standard, but they also differ quite a bit, so make sure to check out the figures on your screen now.
One of the biggest differences is servicing. The MG is a factory-backed outfit in Australia, which means a more fully fledged dealer network. Plus, it only needs to be serviced every 2 years or 40,000 Ks. The average yearly cost over that 8-year period is $300. This is in contrast to the BYD, which is distributed in Australia and needs to be serviced at My Car locations. It needs to be serviced twice as often, once every year or 20,000 Ks, although the average annual cost works out to be nearly exactly the same as the MG.
These are two affordable long-range electric cars that are pretty close together, at least on paper. But what's become clear from our testing is that they each suit a slightly different buyer. The Dolphin over here is for a single or a couple who really appreciates driving and aren't afraid of driving something that is a little bit different with its attention to design. And honestly, it's the one that I would pick. But the truth is, the MG4 is more versatile. It's got a less controversial design and it's much better suited to families with its huge cabin. And as a bonus, it's much nicer to drive on the open road with its rear-wheel drive dynamics, and it's got a little bit of extra range as well. As a result, the MG4 Excite 64 is our winner today, but only by a very slight margin. What do you think? Which of these cars do you prefer? And as always, if you want to check out the full review with all the scores and tables, check it out at carsguide.com.au.